Ukraine's Air Force said it had shot down a Russian spy plane on Friday. If confirmed, it would be a major win for the country as it marks the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. It comes as the prime ministers of Italy, Canada, Belgium, and the president of the European Commission arrived in Kyiv. Their presence meant to display Western solidarity despite a lack of Western aid and ammunition, all while Russia is emboldened by fresh gains. The war has cost tens of thousands of lives and ravaged Ukraine's economy. Here to help us take stock after 2 years is Samantha de Bendern, an associate fellow at Chatham House. Hello to you, Samantha, as well as our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert. Hello to you, Doug. Samantha, I want to begin with you. When this war began, some of the stories we were reading so much about were of Ukrainian resilience, inspiration, Western solidarity. After 2 years, are cracks beginning to show?
Yes, they are. I think they are. And first of all, Ukrainian resilience, I think, is holding up. I mean, yes, people are tired. Yes, there are many tired soldiers, but the country is still resilient. It's still fighting. It is still there. And that, I think, is the biggest lesson to take from this, is that when the war started, everyone was predicting that Ukraine would fall in days. 731 days later, the president is still in place. Russia has managed to conquer a little bit more territory, but it has also lost some of the territory it's conquered. However, I think that the West is, as always towards Ukraine, does not really know what it wants to do with Ukraine. There's been another package of sanctions that was announced last week, really after the death of Alexei Navalny, and it felt that it was more about Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader. And when I read the latest US sanctions, I thought, what? They've only now started sanctioning some of these companies that are directly contributing to the war effort. They're now only now beginning to sanction parts of Rosatom, the nuclear energy industry.
And why were they dragging their feet on
They're dragging their feet because there are so many Western financial interests that are interlinked with Russia's financial interests. It has taken a long time. The US still imports a lot of its uranium from Russia for the US nuclear industry. When the sanctions began, there were some very prominent oligarchs who were sanctioned, yes, but some who were not sanctioned because they were needed for Western business deals. So, yes, the West has united. NATO is more united than ever. NATO is actually enlarged. Putin should win, Recruiter of the Year for NATO. But the West is still doesn't really seem to be understanding the scale of the threat from Russia. It's beginning to wake up. In the last few weeks, people seem to have been waking up when Russia has been making it very clear and attacking the West in a form of hybrid warfare for nearly 2 decades. And I'm running what it will take for the West to really wake up and to really unite and decide what they want to do with Ukraine, whether they really want to help Ukraine, whether it's going to be a lot of nice words, visiting Kyiv, saying, oh, yes, we're here to support you, but still not giving Ukraine the munitions it's been asking for 2 years. And last thing I really like to say is that a lot of Ukrainians, a lot of military analysts say if the West had given Ukraine adequate weapons from the very beginning, not just this drip feed that's been going on over 2 years, drip feed with a lot of noise, and yes, a lot of money has been given. A lot of weapons have not been able to be given because the West doesn't have it. But a lot of weapons were not given because there was this fear of escalation. And now red lines have been crossed, and it's this sort of red line. It's kind of a red snake that sort of, wriggles around and changes according to what we feel. But if the weapons had been given in the very beginning, this war might be over by now.
Yeah, Doug, Samantha mentioned those sanctions. How has Russia's economy fared in the face of those sanctions?
Relatively speaking, it is in fine fettle. Not just despite the sanctions, Putin and his allies might argue thanks to those sanctions. We've seen it in the past, this pattern, sort of perpetuating itself, right? You impose sanctions and Russia has an amazing resilience, an ability to build your cottage industry. So the sanctions have, in a way, paradoxically spurred Russian domestic production. Now, Here's the bad news, or the bad news at least from a Western perspective, Europe, U.S. Russia's economy, in its overall growth last year, outpaced growth in both the U.S. and Europe. It was about 3.5%, 3.6%. That's pretty solid growth. A lot of that, most of that, was thanks to ramped up spending, huge investment on the military. You know, we were arguing here in Europe about spending 2% of GDP on European militaries in order to bring it up to NATO standards. Russia has spent about one third of its budget, I'm not misspeaking here, on its military last year, and that's only been rising. As far as the effect on ordinary Russians, sure, they don't have their Western shops to go to anymore. Sure, they're not traveling to Europe as much. It's much harder to get the visas, all of that. But however, in terms of ordinary life, about 2/3 of Russians, according to the latest polls, say that they are economically the same or even better off than they were before the full-scale invasion 2 years ago. Unemployment is down. Russia and Putin is practically gloating. Trade with India, China, Brazil, largely helping Putin a lot to do what we would say is an end run around sanctions and to really keep the economy churning. How long they could keep it up, who knows?
Yes.
But for now, they're okay.
Samantha, you wanted to
No,
respond.
I'd really like to react to that. So yes, the Russian GDP is growing. That is military spending. If the war stops tomorrow, the GDP will collapse. That is really, this is a fake
true,
growth.
yeah.
It's an economy built on the war.
Secondly, I don't actually believe opinion polls in Russia today.
You can't trust any of them. Yeah.
Thirdly, you look at what's happening to Russians' civilian infrastructure, heating systems collapsing, planes not being able to be maintained because they can't get the components from the West. Automobile production was down by 80% at the end of 2022, and the statistics were so dramatic that Putin forbade Rosstat, the Russian statistical agency, from publishing figures on civilian industry because the figures are actually so catastrophic.
But this is a war of attrition. And size matters, and Russia
size
is
does
bigger
matter.
than Ukraine.
Yeah, size matters. Russia's bigger. Russia has more resources. Russia's not a democracy, so who cares if civilian planes fall out of the sky? People are not going to complain about that. And Russia has more people. So yes, that is a really serious problem that the West and Ukraine has to look at right in the face without any illusion.
I want to ask you the question about Ukrainian politics down the road. Zelensky's term ends in May. There's martial law in Ukraine that allows for the elections to sort of be postponed. What is the situation with domestic politics in Ukraine, and are you concerned what will come in May?
Well, first of all, the Ukrainian constitution actually forbids elections to take place during martial law and during wartime, so that is not necessarily illegal from a Ukrainian point of view. But it's true that there are political problems within Ukraine. I was last there in December, and you could really feel a lot of tension. A lot of people don't like Zelensky, in spite of the fact that we all adore him in the West. Inside Ukraine, there's a lot more ambivalence towards him. There's a recognition that he is the commander-in-chief, that he has brought the country together and done a wonderful job in seducing the West. But inside, there is a lot of political infighting still, Some of it is the result of Russian disinformation. Some of it is the result of the continuing corruption in Ukraine. There's a whole panoply of things. Ukraine is a thriving democracy in the ways that people are arguing all the time. The problem is, in a wartime, it's probably better to not be arguing so much. And we saw the removal of Valery Zaluzhny, who was the chief of staff of the armed forces, replaced by somebody else. Now, again, there are various versions as to what this means. Some say it's because Zaluzhny was a political threat to Zelensky. Other people say, well, he had to be removed because in wartime, people often change chiefs of staff. It happened in the Second World War in the UK, in France, and so it's not such a big deal. But there are political tensions within Ukraine. And of course, if Ukraine were forced to negotiate at some point, then you could expect those tensions to meet. Zelensky would not survive a negotiation. And the question is, who would be in Zelensky's place? Would we have a Russian puppet, or would we have someone on the other end of the spectrum who could be an extreme nationalist? Neither of these options are actually good for Europe at all.
Running out of time, Doug.
Yeah.
Where is Putin's support?
Look, You're absolutely right. The polls, you can't trust them as far as you can throw them. Most Russians are not disinclined, as putting it mildly, to speak truth to pollsters. They don't trust them either. So they're very wary. Everyone's looking over their back. We're back to the Soviet-style period where, neighbors denounce neighbors. Schools are all patriotic. Even school children denounce their classmates. So that the atmosphere is repressive. It's not conducive to polls. That said, with that giant caveat and asterisk, if you're to believe some of the polls by Levada Center, by some of the more respected pollsters in Russia who try to get beyond people's reticence to tell the truth, Putin's popularity is at a 7-year high right now, which is astounding when you think of it. And why is that? Because he has, under the filter of state-controlled media, this filter bubble where people are not able, unless you're young and have VPNs and access to internet, able to get out of that filter bubble. The 100 million plus Russians who sit in front of their TVs and still watch the state-controlled channel every night have been sold the myth, and I will call it a myth, that Ukraine poses an existential threat to Russia, even if he's not still using the language as frequently, denazify Ukraine, Nazis, neo-Nazis running the government. Even if that language isn't used as often, it's still very much there, and it's very much still sold, in a sense, to a large majority of the Russian public. A lot of people don't speak out politically. They become apolitical, apathetic. They just want to keep their own lives, not get into the fray at all. So the polls are absolutely misleading, but Putin, given that, still remains at an all-time high.
A lot to unpack here. I wish we had more time, but I want to thank our guest, Samantha de Bendern from Chatham House, Douglas Herbert, our international affairs commentator. Thanks to you both.